talk a little bit about the Inklings and what took place at the Eagle and Child, which locally is called the Bird and the Baby. Talk a little bit about that, because it's absolutely amazing to think what took place in the Rabbit Room there with Tolkien and the gang.
Well, I mean, that I suppose goes back to Lewis and Tolkien, I think, are probably the centre of the Inklings. And they actually began meeting as a pair before the Inklings started. And the Inklings itself, actually, you can trace back to Lewis's time at University College as well, because there was a student group set up there, which was called the Inklings. And
do we ever know who came up with the term?
Well, the group was founded by a student of PPE, Philosophy, Politics and Economics, called Edward Tanguy Lean. He was actually the brother of the film director, David Lean.
Really?
And so I presume he invented the title, and he just invited friends of his to come and read. And he also invited Lewis and Tolkien along, which, was quite a bold move, I'd have thought, for a student. But they came.
But they were, who were they at that point? They weren't the Tolkien and Lewis that we think of. I mean, they were just
that's true.
Young men.
Yeah, but they were tutors rather than students.
Okay.
But yes, that's true. And but when that group folded, presumably when he graduated, the Lewis and Tolkien kept up the habit of meeting together. Sometimes in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen, sometimes at the Eastgate Hotel, where they used to read bits of their works in progress. And then that, I think, other people, particularly, I mean, Lewis, I suppose, is the real focus of it, because other people who are members of the English department, but also people that Lewis knew, fellow writers. His brother joined it. His doctor joined it.
His doctor joined it.
Yeah. I mean, I think
remember that.
Yeah, that's right. And so, they basically transferred that name, Inklings, because they like the idea of it, sort of an inkling, a bit of a notion, but also somebody who dabbles in ink. And that habit of reading together, hearing things read out loud, and then giving feedback and commentary on it, and just became a kind of, it's sort of a way of life for them both. Meeting both on a Tuesday morning at the Eagle and Child, but also on a Thursday evening in Lewis's rooms at Magdalen.
Yeah. I mean, we have to say that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong in any details, but it was in the back room of this pub where we can go that Lewis read aloud the Narnia Chronicles as he's writing them.
Well, the Narnia Chronicles may not have been read out to the Inklings. It's a bit hard to tell exactly there, because the Inklings kind of, by the time Lewis is writing those, the Inklings is starting to, they're meeting less regularly, fewer people are coming. But it certainly begins, so things like The Problem of Pain, his first work of Christian apologetics, Screwtape Letters, which is, of course, the book that really makes him a household name. It's the book that gets him on the front of Time magazine, for instance.
Yeah.
And Out of the Silent Planet, his first work of science fiction, and Perelandra, the follow-up. Those were all read to the Inklings. The Great Divorce was read to the Inklings. So much of Lewis's writings were, and of course, the whole time that's going on, Tolkien is reading from what they call the New Hobbit book,
which is the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, exactly.
And am I right in believing that it was mostly Lewis's pushing Tolkien to write The Lord of the Rings that made Tolkien write The Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, it got him to finish it. Absolutely. I mean, Tolkien's absolutely clear on that. He says, I don't think Lewis ever really influenced me, but without him, I don't think I'd have ever completed it.
Well, it's just too much to take in, I have to say. The idea, not just that they were such good friends, but that we wouldn't have The Lord of the Rings probably if not for C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, because actually you go back to when they first met in 1926, which is just after Lewis got his job at Magdalen. And at exactly the same time, Tolkien got the professorship of Anglo-Saxon at Pembroke College, which brought him back to Oxford, where he'd been a student, but he'd gone off to Leeds, and he was teaching at Leeds at that time. And they met then shortly after that, a meeting at the English faculty. And then you can tell quite quickly from Lewis's comments in his diary that he kept at the time or in his letters, that the two really were kindred spirits, and they realised that quite early on. You know, there's a nice letter in which he says something about how he'd stayed up till 2:30 in the morning talking to the new professor of Anglo-Saxon about gods and goddesses of Asgard, you know, and their love of the mythology of the North. You know, Lewis himself talks about northernness in Surprised by Joy and how much that affected him. But you know, talking about the mythology of you know, medieval Scandinavia was hugely influential for them both.
Let's talk about that. And one of the places, of course, in Oxford, which is invariably associated with Lewis, is Addison's walk behind Magdalen College, and the experience that he had with Tolkien and Hugo Dyson walking behind there. That it's, again, hard to believe that if not for Tolkien, Lewis may never have become a Christian. Let's start with the northernness, because that's, you know, most of us haven't read Northern Norse mythology. How did Lewis and Tolkien get so interested in it? Why?
Well, Lewis says in Surprised by Joy that one of the things that really introduced him to that concept was coming across a poem by Longfellow about the death of Balder. And he says, you know, I heard a voice that cried, Balder the beautiful is dead, is dead. And that suddenly just transported him to the Norse, to these big, open, empty skies. And I think, you know, those... He also talks about when he was at school that he discovered a book called the Corpus Poeticum Boreale in the school library.
Boreale is for North?
Yes, exactly. The collection, a body of northern poetry. I actually went back to his old school to see if they still had it, but they've got rid of it, unfortunately, because I thought there can't be many people who read that book when they were, you know, 13, which is what Lewis was. And so he was already fascinated with the poetry and the myths that are sort of, you know, the back.
And he didn't know why. He just was.
It was just something about it. And he, of course, he'd also seen pictures of Wagner, illustrations of Wagner by Arthur Rackham, which tell the stories in illustrated form of, you know, the dragon Fafnir and, you know, these great stories, the legend of Sigurd the Viking and so on. And he was clearly captivated by them. And so that's all part of the backstory, I think. And that's something that they obviously shared, these two men, and discussed. And in fact, one of the things that Tolkien did after he met Lewis was to invite him to become a member of the Kolbitar, which was a medieval Icelandic reading group that he had set up.
Huge group, tough to get in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, somewhat niche. But for Lewis, this was the fulfillment of a childhood dream, because he'd always wanted to read these stories in the original language. And so here he was with, you know, an expert. Basically, they had to prepare by translating a chunk of, say, Volsunga Saga, and then turn up, and then they would read it out, and Tolkien would sort of, you know, correct them here and there, and they would work their way. It was actually all the most distinguished philologists in the university that were invited to join this group. And it was Tolkien's way of trying to promote the study of Old Norse language. And so again, that reinforced that kind of interest in northernness. But where that, I think, takes us back to Addison's walk and to that famous conversation that you mentioned is one of Lewis's big objections to Christianity, because of course at that point he had already made a huge step towards belief, which was he'd become a theist a couple of years before they had that conversation.
Now, I don't remember just now how it was that he goes from being an atheist to a theist. Can you remind us? I just don't remember how that transpired. 2 years before he becomes a Christian.
Yeah.
I know he writes about it in Surprised by Joy, but I just don't...
Yeah, that's right. It's that famous passage where he says, you must picture me in that room at Magdalen night after night, you know, desperately fighting against the increasing sort of sense that somebody is there that he most definitely does not want to meet. That's where he calls himself that most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. And so he's at that point, I think, coming to it's a very much a rational process with Lewis, that he cannot find any logical objections. And so in that sense, he finally gives in. He says, that's why I gave in that night and admitted that God was God, the most dejected and reluctant convert.
And there's a film that came out about a year ago called The Most Reluctant Convert, made by a friend of ours, Norman Stone. And, well, it's a famous story, but I guess I'm always trying to think about what were the things that pushed him. We know that Lewis loved Chesterton and he loved George MacDonald, and both of them were, of course, serious Christians. So that had to have something to do with it.
Exactly. And he says that in Surprised by Joy, that a lot of the authors that he loved turn out all to be Christians as well. He never really noticed it. But, Milton and Spencer, for instance, he suddenly felt as if all these authors had been against him all along. He'd loved them, but he hadn't realized that they were all on the other side. And I think that was also pointing towards it. So, yeah, I think, and certainly, as you say, MacDonald, Fantastes, a book that he talks about very passionately in Surprised by Joy, the book that baptized his imagination. Yeah, I had no idea what I was letting myself in for when I read Fantastes, he says. So I think these are all sort of important stepping stones along the way. And obviously, the conversation with Tolkien is hugely influential.
Before we get to Addison's Walk, so what year was it that he becomes a believer in God, a theist?
Well, in Surprised by Joy, he says Trinity Term 1929. But Alistair McGrath, in his biography, has pointed out that there are some problems with that dating, and it's probably actually the following year that Lewis may have just got that wrong.
In any event, he was past 30. It's fascinating to think that he'd gone all of his life up to this point into his 30s as an atheist. Okay, so let's talk about Addison's Walk. About 2 years after he bows the knee, accepts God, he hasn't accepted Jesus. So tell us about what took place on that now kind of mythical evening.
Well, they went for dinner at Magdalen, as they would have done many times. I don't know if they weighed themselves, but then they went for a walk around Addison's, and they began to talk about myths, which is a topic that was, a frequent feature of their conversation. But Lewis was, I think, again, coming back to what was his major stumbling block in accepting Christianity, which was that he couldn't see why it was different from any other myth, including ones that had myths of gods that die and then come back to life. And he felt, I think, because there were parallels between these stories, that he couldn't see beyond Christianity just being another one of those myths. And in fact, if he had to choose between them, he would rather the myths of the ancient North than any other. So the Celtic myths, the Greek myths, the Egyptian myths, all had similar stories. And he felt that that was a major problem for him in accepting Christianity as being true. And what Tolkien did, I think, was try and explain to him the concept of what he calls the true myth, which is something that Lewis went on to write about quite eloquently. Myth Became Fact, that essay that he wrote, sort of comes after this. And that the idea that a story can have mythical appeal, it could speak to you like a myth, but it can also be an account of something that actually factually happened in history. So that history and myth don't have to be completely separate categories.
Well, many people misunderstand the term myth. They think myth means something that didn't happen, and we're talking about myth in the true sense of the word. That it doesn't mean that it didn't actually happen. It might have happened.
Yeah, exactly. And that the other myths might be stories that could be pointing to something genuinely historically true about Christianity, and still be able to speak to us in that way that he felt passionately about, but without necessarily taking away from the historicity of the Christian story. And I think that was, in a sense, one of the things that really took him over the threshold into Christianity, the sense that there could be such a concept as a truth. And there's also another aspect of that, interestingly, where he says that there was this sudden breath of wind swept through Addison's walk at that moment, and it caused all the leaves to...
This is late.
Yeah.
Very late.
Oh, yeah, it's probably about 9, 10 o'clock, I think. Although the evening went on till 3 in the morning.
They went back to his rooms and continued the conversation. Okay, but
exactly.
While they're walking, this is interesting. They're walking on Addison's walk, which is beautiful. I hope people can visit. It's dark. They're having this deep conversation. Okay. And there was, at some moment, this wind. Say this again, because it's
yeah, I mean, exactly. Lewis describes it as saying that what it makes the leaves all rustle in a way that it sounds like there's been a sudden huge downpour of rain. And so the fact that he recalls that, describes it in that way, suggests that alongside this very rational process, something spiritual is awakening in Lewis. And he always emphasizes the importance of these different aspects of the person. But I think at that moment, he's experiencing both sides of that.